Hello and welcome to the Agri-Food Pioneers. We're here to give a voice to companies in the agriculture and food industries, making a real difference to the environment. And today I'm joined by Mark Davis, an accomplished and well-respected senior business manager with a consistent track record of leading, coordinating and delivering large-scale, robust environmental, agricultural and sustainability programs and initiatives. Welcome, Mark, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you to you. Great to be here.
I found out about you and the good work you're doing through a mutual contact who I network with, and I was desperate to get you on. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to be a guest. First of all, can you tell us about your background in sustainability and why you are such a suitable guest to be on the Agri-Food Pioneers?
So originally, I'm trained as an ecologist. That was many years ago when ecology was still a bit of an obscure science. And in fact, I got into it completely by accident. I thought I was going to be going and start studying about, recycling paper and bottles and things like that at the time when Friends of the Earth was starting up those campaigns. And when I started studying ecology and I realized that actually it was the science of how everything around us is interconnected and influences everything, basically. I was completely captivated and fascinated by it. And through that, during my studies, became increasingly interested in the impacts of agricultural activities on the environment around them. And that's really been the focus of my career pretty much for the last 40 years, looking at agriculture and how it interacts with the environment around it, beneficially and negatively. And that's really been how I've developed my career, working in NGOs, in the government sector, in the United Nations, independently as a consultant, as a researcher. So in different sectors, I've worked, always looking at how does agriculture interact with its environment.
Yeah, and that's really fascinating already. So this channel, I set this channel up because I in the media, in the sort of broader media, you only really hear how agriculture is affecting the environment negatively. Whereas in my day-to-day job, I film on farms across the UK and I see farmers doing amazing things, like really positive things. So it sounds like you have a much more balanced view of the positives and the negatives of agriculture. I think most people mainly only see the negative press that they're getting. I'm trying to offer the positive side to the argument. So can you tell us a bit? You've kind of covered who you've worked for and how you began your career. What's been the highlight of your 40 years in agriculture?
I suppose working for 18 years in the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has been, really the pinnacle. That has taken me around the world, allowed me to see and interact with agricultural activities in all sorts of different situations. I think, going back to what you were saying about being two sides of the picture, it's not just that agriculture impacts the environment negatively. We have to understand, and this is what really has evolved in my own thinking. Agriculture is basically a natural activity. You are depending on natural processes in order to grow crops. Without soil and all the activity within the soil, micro fauna and without nutrient releases and without natural processes of water provision, natural pest management processes, without those things going on, you don't have agriculture. Without pollination, for example, you don't have agriculture. So agriculture is entirely dependent on natural processes, and therefore it has to be very closely related to them and look after them. So as you say, there are very positive interactions with nature in agricultural activities. So, I mean, in terms of, what's the highlight? I started working in the UN looking at projects where things had gone badly wrong, in fact. So the core of my initial projects was around dealing with obsolete pesticide stockpiles. And we were finding literally tens of thousands of tons of pesticides sitting around in the countryside, neglected, leaking, contaminating water, contaminating soil. And this was, in developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, Asia. And we set up a program to try and remove these stockpiles. And really what that did was provide us with an entry point to discuss with government, how are they using pesticides? How are they managing them? How are they regulating them? How can we make this better? How can we make things better for farmers so that they don't need to use toxic chemicals? They can actually rely on more sustainable approaches. And we set up a substantial program, working in multiple countries, tens of millions of dollars coming into the program from international donors to support the work that we were doing. And it was pretty exciting. And we were working with multiple partnerships, organizations like the World Bank, United Nations Environment Programme, World Health Organization, several NGOs, nationally, internationally. Worldwide Fund for Nature was part of our program. So yeah, we did some pretty exciting things at that time. From that, my own work evolved into much more kind of international policy frameworks, developing guidance for countries on how they should be managing pesticides better, developing regulatory frameworks for them, and linking into other international processes like the conventions that try and help the world to address serious chemical problems. There's the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. There's the Rotterdam Convention on severely hazardous chemicals, trade, international trade in severely hazardous chemicals. There's the Basel Convention that tries to prevent the movement of hazardous waste around the world. All of these became something that we were very closely engaged with and feeding into, because really nobody else understood what was happening in the world of pesticides. And the world of pesticides is unique because really, when you talk about chemicals management, which is a slightly different angle again, chemicals management largely talks about stuff that's in industry. And how do you control that? And it's not that difficult to control chemicals that are in a factory situation. So you don't put things through a pipe into the nearby river. You deal with it differently. Agriculture is different, because agriculture, you are actually intentionally spreading chemicals that are intentionally meant to be toxic into the environment. It's a very different scenario. So we really need to be thinking very, very hard about that and finding different models to deal with pests and diseases in agriculture. And that's really where my career has brought me and where I am today.
Fascinating. And are there viable alternatives to spraying pesticides or particularly toxic pesticides?
Increasingly, yes, there are. The biopesticide industry is growing much, much faster than the chemical industry, about 6 times faster.
Wow. What is that? What is the bio?
So biopesticides basically use natural organisms, be they extracts from plants or microorganisms or the toxins that microorganisms generate. They use those in order to attack pests and diseases. There's a huge range of them. You can also include in biopesticides things like live organisms, like parasitic insects and predatory insects, for example, nematodes that attack other pest organisms. So, what you need to realize is that the majority of organisms in our environment are actually beneficial. There's very few that are causing harm. And the problem with chemicals, with pesticides, is that they're very broad spectrum. So they pretty much kill everything within a particular group of organisms, which is, causing huge damage. And it's, the knowledge is increasing all the time. And we've known since Rachel Carson published the book Silent Spring in 1962 that pesticides are harmful. But we're still now learning quite how harmful they are. So there's only recently been research and publications about the impact of pesticides on the soil microbiome, where they are not only killing other insects, but they're also killing fungi, which are responsible for breaking down organic matter and releasing nutrients that plants need to grow. So if you're destroying that process in the soil, what are you left with? You become entirely dependent on chemicals, either fertilizers or pesticides, and you're effectively creating an almost sterile environment. And that doesn't work. Yields are going down, and crops are increasingly vulnerable not only to pests and diseases, but also to the impacts of climate change, for example, like drought and extreme events of some sort or another. Whereas in a more resilient environment with a healthier soil, those crops are also more resilient to changes in their environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been making a lot of films about regenerative farming and soil health and people burying pants, and I'm sure have you heard of people burying cotton pants into the soil, and how quickly the cotton degrades and decays? That's an indicator that the soil is more healthy. It's got more biological matter in there. So yeah, that's been a national campaign. Bury your cotton pants.
Okay, I haven't heard of that one. All right.
I'm really interested in these bio fertilizers, or sorry, pesticides.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of how much it costs to actually produce the biopesticide versus the traditional more toxic pesticides, well, do you know anything about that? Is it cost effective to use these products?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to farmers who are using biopesticides or are moving in that direction, it's a different mindset altogether.
Right.
So whereas previously they would buy a bottle of a chemical, put it in their sprayer, drive out into the field and spray it across the whole field. When you're using biopesticides, you're also looking at other methodologies for preventing pests, which might mean cultural controls. So you're rotating your crops, you're intercropping, you're creating barriers in your fields that prevent certain pests from entering. So for example, if you grow a high crop around your field, like maize or like even trees, you can prevent a lot of flying insects from coming in.
Oh, wow.
You can use barriers, physical barriers, such as in some cases netting, but that's an expensive investment. But for a high value crop, it's something that will last you for years. So it's worth doing. You can use traps, light traps, pheromone traps, to bring the pests to the insecticide rather than trying to find a very small pest by spraying insecticide over your entire field. And then the biopesticides come in to augment what you're already doing, you're also depending on the natural presence of predators and parasites in the field. If you encourage them by, through having field margins where these organisms can breed and live happily, they will come into your fields and they will help to control pests and diseases. Where you need to augment them, you can buy biopesticides and you can apply them. And they have different application methods. Sometimes you just need to locate them in certain areas so that they multiply naturally into the field. Sometimes you do need to spray them like you would spray an insecticide, but the timing is important and they are slower to act. They take time to build up and to control the pests and diseases. So farmers need to understand that the immediate response that they will get, for example, by spraying an insecticide is not the same as what they would get from a biopesticide. But increasingly they are understanding that, and extensions and advisory services are understanding that and giving them that information. So it's a rapidly growing area of knowledge and a way that farmers are working. So, I was recently in Bangladesh and I went into a pesticide store and I could see that, a third of the products there were biopesticides.
Mm.
They understand things are moving in that direction very quickly.
Yeah, that's thrilling to hear that because you just think, particularly globally in countries that possibly don't have the same restrictions on access to pesticides and things like that. It's good to hear that these biopesticides are actually being used globally as well. That's great. And I need to ask you as well about about the suicide prevention part of your role, because that's something I saw on LinkedIn, and immediately it's very, very interesting. So how are pesticides linked to suicide, and how do we prevent people actually being affected by that?
Okay, so suicide clearly is an emotive word, and it's pretty sensitive, and in certain cultures it's actually taboo. But what we found is, I'm working with a guy called Professor Michael Edelston. He's a toxicologist, and he was working in Sri Lanka, where he went originally to help develop methodologies for dealing with snakebite. But while he was in the hospitals waiting for people to arrive, he found that many people were arriving poisoned by pesticides. We started looking into this, and he found that actually the majority of people who were arriving had self-harmed by drinking pesticides. So in researching this, and by working with people who specialize in suicide prevention, what they found is that many people go through transient episodes of distress and will consider suicide, and they will reach for something that maybe will send a signal to the community about the level of their distress. If that thing that they're reaching for is lethal, they will die. If it is not lethal, they've sent the signal and they will survive. And in the vast majority of cases, they will not try suicide again. They've sent the signal, it's being recognized, and they will get the support that they need, and they don't go on to try another method of for ending their life. Now, what we found is globally that around 20% of all suicides are carried out through the consumption of pesticides. And what we're saying is that's about 168,000 people every year.
The farmers?
It's mainly well, it's in rural communities. It's where pesticides are available.
Yeah.
So not necessarily the farmers. It could be, their daughter, their son. Quite often it's young people distressing.
Really?
Yeah. But sometimes it is farmers, because farming is a stressful activity. And there's high levels of suicide around the world in farming communities. But like I say, it's other members of the communities as well. So what we're saying is, and what we've found through the work that we've done, in particularly in countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, India, that if you actually remove those very harmful, those deadly chemicals from the community, then the actions of self-harm will continue, but people won't die. And that's what that's what this project's about. It's about saving lives. So in Sri Lanka, for example, they identified half a dozen chemicals that were causing death. They banned them, and farming wasn't negatively impacted. They had other chemicals or other methods that they could use, so there was no problem there. And they reckon that over a period of about 10 years, they saved 93,000 lives.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we're replicating that project in other countries with similar impacts. Now, incredible. From my perspective, I'm not a toxicologist. I'm not a medic. I'm not a mental health expert. I'm somebody who's interested in agriculture and environment. So I came into this project, and what it does is it offers us an entry point. We can start talking with that data, that this number of people are dying because they're consuming pesticides. It opens a door for a conversation with pesticide regulators. I talk to the pesticide regulators and I say, look, there are better ways of dealing with pests and diseases in agriculture. You don't need these chemicals. You will be saving lives by banning them. And let's look at other options for farming that are more sustainable and will help your farmers not only to be safer for themselves and their communities. Their food will be healthier because it won't have residues of toxic chemicals. Their farming practices will be more sustainable. They will be protecting their soil. They'll be more resilient to climate change. They'll be able to export produce more easily because it won't have toxic chemical residues in it. There are so many reasons to move in that direction, and the regulators are ready to listen. So it's really a very effective entry point to open a discussion, and we are saving lives.
Yeah, wow, fascinating. And what an impact. It's just incredible. Let's talk about the future a little bit, if we could. Where do you see the biggest improvements in sustainability from an agriculture perspective over the next 2 to 5 years? I mean, apart from the biological pesticides that we've already talked about, is there anything else on the horizon that we can get excited about?
I'm pretty encouraged by what's happening internationally in conversations around climate change, biodiversity, chemicals management, environmental management. There seems to be a merging of minds around these issues so that they're actually looking and talking about the same issues. So the Convention on Biodiversity just about a month ago renegotiated their targets for the next 30 years because the original set of targets that they had lapsed in 2020 and they had to rethink them. In the new set of targets, they are now saying that in order to protect biodiversity, we need to reduce pesticide use by 60%, which is dramatic. So it's the biodiversity community that's now saying that. Meanwhile, the climate change people are saying soil and agriculture are one of our major carbon sinks that we can build upon in order to reverse the impacts of climate change. In order to use soil as a carbon sink, it has to be a living soil. It has to be full of organic matter, which is breaking down. In order to do that, you have to reduce chemical use and you have to apply practices that maintain and preserve your soil and improve its condition. So that also is a very positive impact in terms of sustainability in agriculture. In the chemicals agenda, when I was with FAO, one of the things that we did together with WHO was we defined a term called highly hazardous pesticides, which basically says there are a relatively small group of chemicals that are causing the majority of harm. Let's focus on those. Let's call that, if you like, the low-hanging fruit and actually get those out of use. And once we've done that, we can open a conversation about where else we go. That term, highly hazardous pesticides, has become part of the international dialogue on chemicals management globally. And all of the international conventions and mechanisms that deal with chemical management now talk about highly hazardous pesticides and the importance of prioritizing action on those. So that's working its way through the global community into national pesticide regulators, regional regulatory bodies like the EU, for example. They've banned all the highly hazardous pesticides. So things are moving in the right direction, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Mark. Before I ask the final question that I ask everyone who comes on the channel, is there anything else that you feel like we haven't spoken about that we should have done? I'm sure, we could talk all day, but anything that might be relevant to the viewers of the channel?
I actually, as you probably gather from this conversation, most of my work focuses on what's happening in the rest of the world. I'm interested by what's happening in the UK because, I've only moved back here a couple of years ago. I was based in elsewhere. And I'm looking closely at what's happening, particularly around, the community where I'm living in Somerset. There's a lot of talk about rewilding. There's a lot of talk about moving towards more natural approaches to land management. I think that's great. I also think it's a privilege. We have to remember that when we import food from other countries, we do that partly to compensate from the fact that we're not producing our own food, some of which we can't produce because we haven't got the climate, but some of which we're not producing because we're letting our land go to other uses. When we do that, we're also importing water, nutrients, labor from other parts of the world. And I think we need to think about that. To what extent are we happy doing that? To what extent do we also need to be conscious of the fact that we need to be producing more of our food more locally and building that in with these more natural approaches? So it's a balance that needs to be struck, and it's not all one way or all the other. None of this is black and white. There's a whole spectrum of options. But for me, having worked internationally and working with farmers in other countries, I think it's important to think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So I think I know what you're going to say, but the final question we always ask is, how can the viewers of the channel help you, Mark Davis, on your sort of mission, your passions? What would you like people to do to kind of help accelerate the improvements that you're already making? What would you say to that? How can we help?
I think that was actually the hardest question on your list. I'm not really sure, but I think what came to mind is it's important that people inform themselves. I read a lot that comes through various email lists and websites and blogs and whatever about environmental issues, about specific, there's a lot of stuff around save the pollinators and ban glyphosate and that. Actually, if I'm absolutely honest, glyphosate isn't the worst chemical out there.
Really?
There are many, many worse things that I'm much more concerned about than glyphosate.
Right.
But that seems to have hit the headlines and everybody's talking about it right now. So the important thing, what I would ask your viewers is inform yourselves. Find out more. When somebody sends you a campaign letter about a particular issue, check it out. Is that really the one that's of most concern? Try and find out more. Try and find out the nuances.
What resources should they be looking at? Is there any particular websites that are good to become more informed about these matters?
I work pretty closely with the Pesticide Action Network UK, Pan UK. They've got a good website, and it's well researched. And in fact, we have commissioned them recently to write and publish some academic papers around some of the work that they've been doing on alternatives to chemical pesticides. And they've just published one on alternatives to paraquat. And paraquat is a herbicide which is really, really toxic. It probably kills more people than any other pesticide in the world.
Wow.
And it's produced in the UK, so we can be proud of that. And it is banned in the UK, and we're still exporting.
What?
So we should not be very proud of that at all.
No, how the hell that doesn't make any sense.
It's outrageous. And if you write, I would encourage your viewers to write to their MP and say we should ban the production of paraquat. The problem with that is, however, that if we ban the export of chemicals that are banned here, they will simply shift production to other countries, and that's what they've done as well.
Yeah.
So then other countries become defensive about that chemical because they're producing it, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
So really, there are issues out there that are complex.
That is complicated. So really, we need an alternative to this chemical that's cheaper than what they're currently producing.
So, like I say, we've just commissioned a paper that's been published talking about alternatives to paraquat. So, yeah, I would be much more concerned about, campaigning about paraquat than about glyphosate.
Sure. What was the website again? Sorry.
pan-uk.org.
All right. Well, pan-uk.org. Take a look, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us, Mark.
It's been my pleasure. Been really interesting talking.
Yeah, really interesting talking to you too. Like I said before, I think we could literally talk all day. But half an hour is what we cap these episodes at. So subscribe now and click the bell so you're notified when we speak to more pioneers of the agri-food industry that are leading the way to a sustainable, low carbon and regenerative future. Thanks for watching. Are you an agri-food pioneer? Get in touch now to arrange your interview.